So for those of you who have seen my first impressions video of Tormented Souls, you may feel like you're about to get a dose of deja vu for a couple of minutes, but bear with me as you're about to get a dose of deja vu for a couple of minutes. For those that haven't, my initial impressions of the demo were pretty impressive, as I believe the game could have the potential to be a return to form for classic survival horror, and it was enough to pique my interest and get a sale from me. Now, having played this thing the whole way through, my opinion has now changed. The idea that this could be a fantastic throwback is gone. Tormented Souls has now solidified in my mind that this absolutely is a return to form for classic survival horror, and whilst it is far from perfect, having a number of issues with its combat and at times a little too ambiguous puzzle design, it really doesn't detract from the new idea that Tormented Souls is one of the best survival horror games I have played in recent times. Welcome to the broadcast, my name is Naj and this is my final review for Tormented Souls. If you like my content, give me a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumbs down. Let me know in the comments below, and if you're feeling extra spicy, hit that subscribe button. Tormented Souls is co-developed by Abstract Studios and Duel, two indie development teams that have minimal staff, but maximum effort and admiration for its video game influences. Developed as a homage to survival horror games from as far back as the PS1, PS2 days, in particular the Silent Hill and Alone in the Dark franchises, Tormented Souls was in development for quite some time, during which it went through multiple phases with its beta testing. Over the course of time, the game developed with feedback from its potential player base in mind, which helped build a community for this game before it was even out. I didn't experience any of this myself, as I only came to know about the game from the demo a few weeks before launch, but it was nice to see when doing a bit of research on the game that the development team cared about what the fans liked, disliked and ultimately wanted from this game. And they pulled it off. As a fan of the games it clearly wants to slip a cheeky finger in, Tormented Souls gave me a nostalgia trip back to the 90s without the need of illegal substances. But there in itself you could say lies a problem. This game is for a very specific audience who have very specific needs, and relies on, I would say, us older gamers to be a success. Younger audiences, or perhaps I should say audiences who never experienced these type of games, may find the design to feel somewhat dated and a challenging game to invest in, but you know what I say? Fuck 'em! This game was made for the fans by the fans, and that's exactly what we got. We take control of Caroline Walker, a young woman who receives a mysterious photograph of two twin girls from Waldberger Hospital. Having strange dreams and reoccurring headaches since receiving this photo, Caroline feels inclined to visit Waldberger and do some digging around as to who these two girls are and why she received it. Upon her arrival, Caroline is bonked on the head, wakes up in a bath that looks straight out of the Matrix prop room, has an eye missing, and soon realises she is not alone in this abandoned mansion turned hospital. Occupied by no one except freaky monsters that appear like they have just been experimented on and not too happy about it, and a local priest who, well, of course knows nothing about the dodgy photo of the children. Honest. We search for the truth behind the missing children and Caroline's connection to them. The narrative that drives you through this game can be a bit of a mixed bag, mostly due to the way the story is told. The majority of this tale is told through the environment and lore scattered throughout its various journal entries. These are well written, and discovering them gave me a sense of accomplishment throughout as I slowly pieced together this puzzle of history behind the hospital and its occupants. Each document added to the layering story in an interesting way, and this is where all of the good storytelling came from. Granted, if you are someone who doesn't care for literature and video games and would tell them just to go read a book, and you would rather just power through these, then the story may be a little bare bones for you as you are throwing away all of the meat. This does though have a massive contrast to it, as the storytelling through the characters and their dialogue is like night and day. The voice acting is absolutely terrible, and Caroline sticks out like herpes on the tip of your lip. Even the mightiest of heroes would drop a deuce or two being stuck in this place, but Caroline seems so unfazed as to what is going on around her, and the way the dialogue is delivered just takes you out of the horror every time she speaks.
What is going on here? This place is infested with nightmarish creatures. I need to be strong. I can't quit now.
I wouldn't say I actively disliked her as a character, but she didn't really do much for me either. I mean, even dressed like this. Perhaps she planned to take the twins to an anime cosplay event once she found them, I don't know. It just felt like someone reading for an audiobook or rehearsing for a play as opposed to giving it all on the night. Which was a shame, seeing as everything else happening within the core story was so captivating. The mystery behind the hospital, the religious undertones to the experiments going on as you discover the lore. It was all very interesting stuff, and I actually looked forward to the next bit of journal reading, which was nice, as I am sure we have all played some games with the intent of reading the documents, but eventually just skim through them at best due to the excess literature. That ultimately becomes boring. That didn't happen here, which was a nice change. Story aside though, what really makes this game special is the gameplay loop and how the experience is amplified by the game's presentation with its visual and sound design. This is a genuinely scary game. A horror game that is done well and does not rely on constant cheap jump scares that become tiresome and predictable. Instead, it relies on its incredible atmosphere that makes even the simplest task of walking down a corridor terrifying. This is something I feel sorely lacks in modern horror games. I mean, it may also be something to do with the fact that I am a 28-year-old man, but I am confident in saying that many horror games are devoid of any real suspenseful, psychological horror, and instead replaces that with either jump scares or kind of a newer trend, buckets of blood and gore to shock players as much as they can. Despite the game's initial warning straight out of the Resident Evil games, Tormented Souls cuts back on the shock value and making your hemorrhoids almost popping out of your asshole, and utilises the quiet moments, the setting and the suspense of the unknown to create its horror, which, for me, is far more effective. What the disclaimer should say is make sure you play this with lights off and headphones on. The music and environmental sound design are enough to get the heart pumping. What I really liked was how the music would slowly build up its drawn out deep tones as you explore the halls of the mansion or the depths of the basement, putting you on edge at all times, and the best thing about it is, sometimes there is nothing there. It builds you up for nothing and makes you wonder why you even got scared in the first place, which makes the times where there is something there even more impactful. It plays on the imagination, and that can be a frightening thing. Visually, the game is absolutely gorgeous. With its fixed camera perspective, it really sets up some beautiful framing, giving some nightmarish but picturesque setups. It felt like some sort of German expressionism movie with its awkward positioning and its dark, silhouette-filled crooked corridors, complete with some great lighting effects that really gave the hospital an insidious tone. It's all visually pleasing and a joy to explore, although very reminiscent of previous locations we have seen in previous games aesthetically. But with its impressive graphics, it gives these levels and gameplay a modern feel, even if it all feels as a package a little too much at times like a recreation of those classics. Speaking of recreating the classics, honestly, I don't have a book on awesome segues, but I should write one. Let's talk about the gameplay, and this is arguably the decider as to whether you will like this game or not. Being a homage to the horror games of old, this brings with it fascinating game design that I personally really enjoyed, but there were times in which the data design did work against it. The big focus of this game is exploration and puzzle solving, as Tormented Souls really does have its eye, focused on these aspects and are the most prominent goals you'll be completing throughout your playthrough. The hospital is one giant labyrinth of complex architecture that makes you wonder how busy the waiting rooms were due to doctors being unable to leave their offices as they forgot the key combination to their door. And just like doctors, God, how does he do it? You too will need a brain to get through this game. Tormented Souls features some of the most compelling and straight up headache inducing puzzles I have experienced in a game for a while. It relies on the player to use their memory as much as their intellect at times, and I really enjoyed for the most part how there is no hand holding or tips given as to solve these puzzles or to progress through the game. There are no quests or objective markers, it was down to me to discover where to go and what to do next. This added a layer of challenge to the game outside of combat, as exploration itself is a puzzle. It required me to use my growing knowledge and understanding of the game world to progress, to the point in which I actually used pen and paper, who knew they existed, to help me work out solutions to puzzles, or to remember where certain elements were I knew I'd have to come back to in time. It reminded me of the good old days when your game cases would be filled with your own DIY walkthroughs and cheats. I do have to say though, in later stages of the game you will find there is a lot of backtracking as you try to figure out puzzles or even just where to go next. Whilst many of the puzzles were smart and gave me a sense of victory once solved, there were a few times I was completely stumped due to the puzzle solutions being a little too ambiguous. For example, there was a puzzle in which I was required to change the TV channels in a certain way to progress, and I could not for the life of me understand how I would know which order to do this in. A lot of trouble for me came from trying to figure out how to figure out the solution, let alone figure out the solution. I'll admit there were 2 times in my playthrough where I had to resort to my good old friend the internet for assistance, as much as I tried not to do this, but I was aimlessly wandering the halls of the hospital, looking in every nook and cranny for some kind of tip, and it just wasn't happening. Once I looked up the solution for this puzzle and another that had me trying to unlock a till of all things, something a well-placed hammer could solve, but, you know, whatever, I had some mixed feelings. The latter of the two I thought, of course, how stupid of me. The answer was staring me right in the face. The former though, I thought, How the fuck was I supposed to know that? Honestly, if I hadn't looked it up online, I probably would have never finished this game, because from what I could see at least, there was no logical sense to the solution. Perhaps it was just so vague that it went straight over my head, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, be prepared for the pacing at times to come to a standstill as you struggle to solve these. Sometimes you'll look back in stupidity as you realise the solution was staring you in the face, or you'll feel like they're taking you for a mug and never wanted you to solve it. It doesn't happen too often, but when it does, be prepared for some hair pulling. Most of the puzzles require you to form some kind of combination to a key or a lock of some sort, or combining items and placing them in the relevant locations. The game does have an interesting use of dual realities, kind of like Silent Hill or more recently The Medium, where you traverse through a mirror or projector screen with found videotapes, essentially travelling to a different time in history at the hospital. Some of these locations were freaky as hell. I mean, look at this. Who does this shit? In these puzzles you'll be taking items from different time periods or causing an event in the past to alter something in the future. It does have some pretty good play on time travel, and seeing some of these events unfold were pretty cool to witness. However, Caroline had some weird reaction to them. We as the player are completing these tasks, however she doesn't ever really appear to be aware of her actions in the mirror world. One example is we have to help the priest with a certain medical issue, but she has no recollection of it. It was difficult to understand how these events worked from a narrative perspective, if we as the player are aware but Caroline wasn't, and it never really explained why this was the case, or even how these, we'll call them time portals, worked. It just did.
I don't know how I'll be able to thank you for taking care of my arm, my child.
What are you talking about, Father? It wasn't me.
And it was never really explained in the narrative like I expected it to be, making these gameplay sections seem a little out of place with the narrative, even though they were interesting and fun to play. Throughout your adventures through this hellish shithole, you'll be using a variety of items to help you along your merry way. A trusty lighter to light up corridors, medikits, keys and tools, and tapes that you will use to save your progress. Once items are used though, they are gone for good. Now you may be thinking this is a weird and obvious thing to state, as that is the case in most games, but what I mean by that is you can't simply load an autosave or a quick save if something doesn't go according to plan, whether that be an underestimated step back from an enemy causing you to waste a medkit. The only way to save is to use tape recorders, paying homage again to the Resident Evil typewriter, and this is limited due to needing tapes to save your progress. This is a balancing act of knowing when to save or to explore that little more, saving the tape for later down the line, but of course with this comes the risk of being screwed over. This adds a layer of trepidation early on in the game, as the fear of facing something we haven't seen yet without saving is terrifying, knowing that a ton of progress could be lost should you not save. But save too often, and you may not be able to later when the need is greater. It makes for some truly thrilling and intense moments when you realise you have been going perhaps a little too long without saving, and it kind of puts you on edge and makes you uncomfortable knowing that everything could be lost. Me personally, I found the ratio of tapes to the need or want to save was pretty well done, but to be honest, this may have been due to my pre-existing knowledge of the game thanks to the demo. I ran through a good chunk at the start of the game without saving because I knew what horrors awaited, as enemy placements were identical to the demo. So from this I managed to save 2 or 3 tapes which were in my backlog for the majority of my playthrough, giving me that edge. Without that knowledge though, I can see players seeing the need to save at every opportunity early in the game, probably putting them more at risk than I was. That being said, I did feel the nerves getting to me once I got into uncharted territory and the number of tapes slowly reduced. You can find maps of the hospital which help give you an understanding of the layout, however it is pretty bare bones, and if for nothing but efficiency I would have liked to see them take a few more cues from the latest Resident Evil games for example. Unlike Resi, it does not colour code rooms based on the 100% completion, and it probably would have helped a little bit with the pacing issues when not knowing where to go to have some kind of guide as to what was complete and what was not, rather than searching every room top to bottom 10 times over like you were heading up a drug raid, but I guess at the same time they didn't want to give us everything racked up on a silver platter. Initially at launch the map didn't even indicate which room you were in, but they did add this with a patch after launch. So whilst the main pull of the game I would say is feeling like you are trying to break out of the most advanced escape room in the world, there is of course the monsters that cross your path. The game has tank controls with its fixed camera angles, and whilst it is competent enough, the combat is unfortunately the game's biggest downfall. There isn't much to it. You stand, aim, shoot, rinse and repeat. You cannot move in combat, but you don't really need to. There are a variety of enemies in the game, the early boys being these guys in wheelchairs with hands for blades, or blades for hands rather, and these legless crawly bastards as I guess they ran out of wheelchairs. The earlier enemies take a good 7 hits from the nail gun to put them down, so there are only 2 things you really need to take into consideration. 1, you have enough ammo, and 2, you have enough distance between you, the target, and the space behind you, as you do have the ability to dash back if the enemies get too close, giving some room between you. Sometimes though, due to the camera angles, it is hard to tell where the enemies are or if there is enough space behind you, resulting in some frustrating combat encounters where both ammo and healing items can be wasted due to restriction in your visibility. It's all part of the learning of the levels, but I would have liked the combat to have a little more manoeuvrability for those claustrophobic encounters. Luckily for me though, the enemies aren't always that on the ball, as the AI at times can be pretty downright bad, with enemies being completely oblivious to my presence, even whilst I stand next to them clearly in their line of sight. It was times like this where I could just avoid combat altogether once I learned some of the enemy placements, saving the ammo for more pressing matters. The tools of the trade are literal tools. There are 3 weapons in the game: a nail gun, a shotgun made from a couple of rusty pipes, and an electric prodder. Once you come up against a few more advanced enemies later in the game, the shotgun basically becomes an instant win for all. Only able to load 1 bullet in the chamber at a time, it does come with its problems. Whatever the enemy, the shotgun will just knock the enemy to the ground, bang, straight out. Once down, just equip the pistol from the menu and shoot it a few times until it gets back up, before switching to the shotgun or the prodder again, which does the same thing. Opening up the inventory does pause the game in the background, so you can probably see where I'm going with this. Combat is just so easy to cheese your way through. Once you realise the overpowering effects of the weapons in the insta-pause inventory, you can shoot, switch, or you can even reload in the menu, so if you do run out of pistol bullets or nail gun bullets whilst one of those things scurries towards you, there's no need to dodge and reload, just do it in the inventory and carry on blasting. Yeah, I know it's my choice to do it this way, but if the game allows me, then why wouldn't I take advantage of it? Especially if I haven't saved for a while and run the risk of losing progress because I needed to reload. It makes the combat very one-sided, which ultimately leads to the enemies becoming threatless. Later in the game you do come across your token unkillable stalking foe that kinda looks like that bird Henrietta out of The Evil Dead 2, and even when she corners you, a quick blast to the face with your rusty pipe puts her down long enough for you to escape the hag. So yeah, in conclusion, I guess you could say the combat kinda sucks, the dialogue is so poor that I've seen cleaner deliveries in the maternity ward, and the aforementioned occasional ridiculous puzzle can cause some pacing issues, but Tormented Souls still somehow manages to be a freaking good game. My first playthrough took me around 9 hours to complete, but I could see this being half that if you know where you're going, which leads me to my final criticism that this is pretty much a one-time play kind of game, which I found kind of odd considering the inspiration. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, all that, they gave players incentive for replayability with different difficulty levels, some of which change up puzzles and enemy placements, unlockable costumes, guns, multiple endings that are determined by events and player actions throughout the entire game. There are 3 endings to this game, 2 of which are set in motion by a singular decision near the climax, and the other being if you didn't locate a certain item, which you likely will find. So don't be expecting to play through this game multiple times needing specific requirements to unlock all endings, or even a secret ending where everything is controlled by a dog. There is no replayability factor for the game except for maybe speedrunners who would probably beat this thing in less than an hour if mastered. But the guys over at Abstract Studios and Duel Effect have ultimately given us what they promised. A genuinely scary, atmospheric trip with cleverly designed exploration and puzzles that pays fantastic homage to the old classics. Yes, it probably plays the nostalgia card a few times, but at the end of the day, who cares when all I can say from the experience is that I've never had so much fun on the edge of shitting my pants. There, put that one on the poster.